Hello everybody, welcome back. Hope you had a good lunch. So we're gonna start our afternoon session with our first keynote speech from Vanessa Nakate. To chair this session, I invite my colleague, Dr. Lisa Guppy. She is a lecturer in Global Humanitarian Studies here at IRDR. And Lisa is going to chair this session. So over to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Hi everybody. Thank you for coming back so promptly from lunch. This is a bit awkward. It's a hybrid, so I'm going to be facing this way, but you'll see me on the screen, so I hope that is okay. So I have a very great pleasure of introducing Vanessa Nekate. And Vanessa is a climate justice activist from Uganda and the founder of the Africa-based Rise Up movement. She began striking for the climate in her hometown of Kampala in January 2019 after witnessing droughts and flooding devastating communities in Uganda. She now campaigns internationally to highlight the impacts of climate change already playing out in Africa, as well as promoting key climate solutions, such as educating girls. In 2020, Vanessa was named a United Nations Young Leader for the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as being listed as one of BBC's 100 Women of the Year and the 100 most influential young Africans. So welcome, Vanessa, to today. We hope that there'll be no technical difficulties, but if there are, we're on standby to help. And please do just begin, and we'll let you know if there's anything in the room that goes wrong as well. Welcome again.
Great. Thank you very much. I hope nothing goes wrong. I'm very happy to be speaking with all of you today. My name is Vanessa Nakate. I'm a climate justice activist from Uganda. And like you've heard, I started striking for the climate in January 2019. I remember in 2018, towards the end of the year, I started to do research about some of the challenges that the people in my country, Uganda, were facing. And it's in that moment that I got to understand how climate change was affecting people in my country. And of course, being in school, we've had, lessons on climate change, but it only ends on it being the changes in weather conditions over a long period of time. And we never really get that, experience of what is happening on the ground and what is happening in people's lives. So it ends on a class and then an exam, and that's it. So I was really surprised in 2018 to see how much impact the climate crisis was causing to so many people, and what this meant for people's livelihoods, people's lives, and people's homes, and everything that pertains to their living and to their survival on this earth. So I decided to read more about climate change to get to understand what causes it, to understand, everything that is about the climate crisis. And from that, I made the decision to start striking. After seeing Greta from Sweden strike every Friday, I also started to organize and strike, hoping that I would create awareness about what was happening and get more people to understand the challenge that so many people were experiencing at that time. And in my country, Uganda, some of the challenges that I really saw were the flooding and the landslides. And of course, as the global temperatures continue to rise, there are changes in weather patterns. And when these changes occur, that means that rainfall is going to be disrupted. So when you expect rainfall in a certain period of time, it won't come. And when it comes, it will come in form of extreme rainfall, causing massive destruction in people's communities. So when it came to Uganda, some of the examples were the flooding and the landslides in the eastern part of Uganda, in areas of Bududa, in areas of Bundibujo, and how these people were being impacted, by the climate disasters, and also in the western part of the country with extreme flooding, destroying people's livelihoods. And in the northern part of the country, seeing the intensity in the dry seasons, leading to the drying of crops and the drying of water sources. So when it came to Uganda, the climate crisis was majorly and continues to majorly impact the access to water for many communities, and also the access to food for different communities. Because when these disasters happen, farms are destroyed or crops are dried up. Water sources are either contaminated or they are dried up. People's businesses are destroyed. We've also seen schools destroyed because of extreme flooding, and hospitals. So it's evident that the climate crisis is not something that is coming in the future. It is something that is happening right now, something that is impacting the lives of the people right now. And beyond Uganda, across the African continent, which historically is responsible for less than 4% of the global emissions. And yet we are seeing so many Africans suffering some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis. We've seen the most recent floods in South Africa that left more than 300 people dead and thousands more displaced, and people losing their homes. And we also saw tropical storm Anna still in Southern Africa. We saw cyclone Batsirai in Southern Africa, and the cyclone that ripped apart large parts of Africa in 2019. Cyclone Idai that left thousands of people displaced. And we can't forget about the Eastern Africa drought that has left more than 20 million people with no access to food across the Eastern Africa region, seeing an unfolding food crisis in West Africa. So it's really evident that the climate crisis is already impacting the lives of so many people right now. And of course, we have the demands for keeping global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. But even at 1.2 degrees, we have seen catastrophic events destroying people's livelihoods, people's present, making it very catastrophic. So, I mean, it's a matter of life and death for so many communities that are already on the front lines of this crisis. And, that's one of the horrible realities of this crisis, that those who are least responsible are the ones who are suffering most from this crisis. And while these communities across Africa, across the global south, while these communities are on the front lines of the climate crisis, they are not on the front pages of the world's newspapers. We've seen how, when it comes to coverage of climate disasters, is still limited. When it comes to representation and platforming of different activists and communities from the most affected areas, it is still limited. It's 2022 and we are still seeing activists struggling, to get to climate conferences because of hectic, complicated visa processing, because they cannot access accreditation to be able to attend a climate conference and talk about what's happening in their communities. And yet we know that every activist has a story to tell, and every story has a solution to give, and every solution has a life to change. But these experiences and these stories and these solutions, they need to be platformed, but we are not seeing enough of that, especially for the activists on the front lines. And hopefully, as we head towards COP27, which is going to be in Egypt, we have that much needed representation of voices from the global south to be able to tell their stories and what's happening in their communities, and talk about the demands that they have for their communities and for their families and for their children when it comes to a much more safer and sustainable world. And as all these disasters unfold, I'm glad to say that very many young people across Uganda, across Africa, across the world, they're not silent. We are doing everything we can to really put our demands on the table. We are using every platform, every opportunity that we get. We are using the streets as well to mobilize and organize and demand for climate justice, because we know that if we are to address this issue, we need to communicate the need to phase out all new fossil fuel infrastructure. We cannot have any new fossil fuel infrastructure because we can't find ourselves subsidizing and still investing in the same industry that has caused so much harm in so many communities. There is a need to really scale up on clean, affordable, renewable energy, across the world, but especially in communities that are already vulnerable to the climate crisis, to help these communities shift their people from energy poverty. Because as the climate crisis escalates, there is also, energy poverty in so many of these communities. And we really need a scaling up of renewable energy in these communities. And one of the other key demands, especially as we head to COP27, is the need for climate finance for the most vulnerable, again, nations to the climate crisis. We know that billions of dollars of climate finance has been promised for mitigation and adaptation, but that is not enough. And again, it's just a promise. It hasn't yet been delivered. The $100 billion has not yet been delivered for the communities that are on the front lines of the climate crisis. So again, we need climate finance, but we don't need it in promises. We need real action, because promises don't stop the suffering of people. Only real action stops the suffering of people. And in addition to finance for mitigation and adaptation, we also need a loss and damage facility to be put in place for the communities that are already experiencing loss and damage right now. We need to put loss and damage on the agenda. We need to put people on the agenda of our discussions. Many times, you find yourself in a climate conversation or in a climate summit, and the conversation is really around what needs to be done, but then there is nothing about the people. But climate change is more than statistics, it's more than data points, it's about the people. It greatly impacts the people, and so it is with climate justice. It's beyond having solar panels installed in communities. If the people are not in the conversation or in those decisions, then it is no climate justice. So there's really a need to put people in the conversation to be able to achieve the climate justice that we are all demanding for. And we also believe that we believe that we can do this. We believe that we can all, work together and make the world a better place. Because when people are united, they cannot be defeated. That's something that gives us strength even as we continue to organize and mobilize. And also the fact that, another world is not only necessary for all of us, but it is actually possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Before I open questions up to the audience, I had a question of my own, and I'll go back to the beginning of your talk when you talked about educating yourself about climate change. Now, in the audience here, we have a range of researchers, and this morning we were talking about sharing science, whether that's social science or quantitative climatological science, with the public, with activists. And I was just wondering if you could talk to us about educating yourself about climate change, as we all have done, and what messages you would give to scientists and researchers about educating activists, passing information to activists, and then making that a two-way exchange.
Thank you very much. Well, for me, it was, mostly a place of trying to understand what was already happening in my community, trying to find out the challenges, and realizing that climate change was one of those challenges, and just deciding to read about it and get to understand what it really means. To me, that was very helpful in my journey as an activist, because again, it's what triggered me to start doing something about it. And also, even along the way after starting activism, that it has been a place of learning, because there's so many things I still didn't know even when I started activism. So I think when it comes to researchers and scientists, I think it's really important to make the necessary knowledge available for people, because I think sometimes the problem is access to this information, or the problem is, how much this information reaches the public. Because again, to use my own example, if I didn't decide to find out what was happening, in my country, I would have never got to know about climate change. I would have never got to actually now look for information or any kind of available data about climate change. So meaning it was not accessible to me in the first place. It's not something that I would see before choosing to search about it. So I think we really need to communicate and push this information as much as possible for people to know what is happening. And I think also the other thing that's really important is the issue of language. Language is very key, because not everyone will understand, for example, what 1.5 means. But then I know some people that we've worked with, especially in the rural areas in my country, they don't know what 1.5 is, but they know that there are times when the intensity of the drought is so much, so their crops die and dry up. So they also know when they were supposed to receive rainfall at a specific time, but then they didn't, and then they received it at another time, and it destroyed all their crops. So they can understand that there is a problem. I don't have a name for it, but this problem is affecting my access to food. It's affecting my access to water. So I think even language is really important, based on who we are, communicating or taking this information to. So there is a place where I will use 1.5, and there is a place where I won't use 1.5. So it's a place of understanding which language people will. It's a place of understanding which language people will relate with mostly, and communicating using that language.
Thank you, that was a lot of food for thought. So I'd like to open it up to the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question for Vanessa. Sorry, we just have a problem with our microphone. One moment.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for an excellent talk. So my name is Lisa Duncan, I'm a lecturer in global health here at IRDR. I've done some work in northern Uganda, so I understand the context. So my question is, how do we ensure that the vulnerable are not left behind in Uganda, given that 12% of the population, which is about 4 million people, face some form of disability? So how do we ensure that they're included in this climate debate?
Did you hear that question okay, or shall I repeat it? So Lisa asked a question of Uganda, and given that there is around 4% of the population who are vulnerable, 12% of the population who are vulnerable, how do we ensure that they're included in climate change? And people with disabilities was particularly mentioned. So
I couldn't hear you clearly, sorry.
okay, so can you hear me now?
Yeah.
We're having some problems. Sorry, we're having some problems with the sound. So Lisa asked a question that was about Uganda. There is about 12% of the population of Uganda who are particularly vulnerable, and Lisa mentioned people with disabilities particularly. How do we ensure that the most vulnerable are not left behind? Now, I'm using my words there. How do we ensure that the most vulnerable are included in this climate change discussion and action, perhaps, and also included in the solutions?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think when it comes to, the most vulnerable people and how to include them, in conversations, I think it's a place of understanding how, the climate movement should be intersectional and inclusive of everyone. And also it goes back to, for example, climate conferences, I should say, or whatever is organized by the different organizations to have, different young people come and speak. Many times, very many vulnerable, young people face challenges to access these conferences because sometimes I'm thinking of how to really explain it, but it seems hard for the people organizing to have, for example, a disabled young person to go to this event. For example, if that person is to come from Uganda, maybe to a country in Europe, they may feel like they have to put in extra expenses for that. So they would rather not have, that person come for the conference to avoid those expenses or to avoid the necessary, things that may come with that. So I think that has been a challenge for so many young people, especially those who are disabled, to be able to access, these climate conferences and to be able to have these platforms and talk about their stories. I think that's where, some of the challenges that I see with that, like the issue of actually having these people in the rooms to talk about their stories and not have someone else talk about their stories because of, the different, worries of the organization organizing. I think those are some of the challenges I've seen. And it kind of course, it excludes or it erases their stories and their experiences. Because for example, I shouldn't talk about the experience of a fellow activist who is, for example, disabled in Uganda, when they can do that themselves, when they can come to this conference and speak for themselves and tell their story. So I think it starts with making these conferences as inclusive as possible, and having everyone involved. I think that's what really needs to be done, to understand that the climate conversation must not live anyone behind.
Answer. Are there any other questions from the audience? Please raise your hand. Yes, right up the back.
Hi there. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. My name is Xiaohan. I'm a PhD student in UCL IRDR. I just would like to know about how the Uganda government could help to dealing with those vulnerable groups, because I used to have a field trip in Uganda, Kampala, in Kalimati community. You probably know that this is a community with informal settlement. And I saw in the rainy season, the residence building was sink down to the soil, and which make their properties completely dangerous. One of the public schools building has been destroyed, and because of the foundation is getting soft. I just want to know how the local government can help the vulnerable group in this case.
So that was a question around the role of the local government in Uganda. And I know there's obviously not just one, but local governments in Uganda, what role they play, particularly in informal settlements where we know that a lot of vulnerable people or people more vulnerable to climate changes may live.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the role of the local government, to speak like from my own experience and the experience of, the activists that we work with in Uganda, we've never really like had a moment of dialogue or conversation with the local government. And of course, we can't invite ourselves to these places if we've not been invited. So I think there's really responsibility for the local government to be supportive of the work that activists are doing, and to actually be willing to have dialogue with them and get to understand, what we are doing and why we are doing it, and what our demands are when it comes to, the climate and the environment of Uganda, and also the necessary protection of the planet at large. So me personally, I have been doing activism since 2019, but I have never, no one in the local government has really shown interest to get to know what I am doing or why I'm doing it. And it's the same with so many other activists. So I think there is really a place for the local government to be supportive of the work of the activists, and also to listen. And sometimes we actually find these people, in the conferences that we go to. For example, the COP, sometimes you see someone from your government and you have no idea who you are. And if you've been maybe in the media for some days during the conference, for example, the COP, then they can recognize you, and they can say hi and all that. I can give an example of when in 2019, when I attended the Youth Climate Summit in New York. I got the opportunity to meet some of the leaders in my country, some of the members of parliament, and some of them knew who I really was. They had read about interviews about my strikes, but again, they had never reached out. And also they gave cards, like business cards, to reach out to them once in the country. And I remember doing that once I got back in the country, and there's never been a response since 2019 up to now. So it's really, I think there is still a problem with local government supporting the work of activists.
Thank you. Another question, just here, down the front.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Can you hear me?
I'll have to repeat the question, that's okay.
Louder. My name is Maria, and I'm a researcher from the Philippines. In the Philippines, the Philippines is one of the countries with high rates of killings of environmental activists and human rights defenders. I wondered whether you have been aware of, or if you've been involved in discussions or activism to protect environmental defenders, and whether that's something that you yourself have experienced or been fearful of in terms of violence or intimidation for the work that you do.
So that question was from Maria, who's a researcher from the Philippines, where there are instances, or perhaps I should say systemic processes of intimidation and violence against environmental activists, which obviously happens in many countries in the world. And the question was whether you had been fearful of or experienced threats as an activist, and what experiences you've had in Uganda or when you've been in other countries, and what your thoughts are on that issue.
Yes, that is, something that I have worked on. I think last year I did a podcast series, and it was more of me talking about the stories of different environmental defenders who had lost their lives because of the work that they were doing. I can share the link to that podcast in the chat. And also when it comes to my country, I haven't had specific threads towards the work that I'm doing. But just to say, of recent, we've been doing a campaign around the East Africa crude oil pipeline that is to be constructed from Uganda to Tanzania. And we've been doing this for quite a while with different activists. But then recently, we've been, I think the local media hadn't picked it up yet, but now the local media picked it up in the past weeks or a month, and it has been everywhere, in the local media, talking about activists who are stopping the development of a country, or activists who are fighting against this pipeline. So it's something that kind of worried the activists who have been working on that, because of how much it was amplified in the local media and how much it was on social media. And me personally, I don't know about other activists, but me personally is just getting many of these messages or tweets at me saying I am against the development of a country, or I am working for the people in the global north to stop the development. And yet that is not the case. When we say we don't want an oil pipeline, it's for the protection of the environment and the ecosystems, but above all for the protection of the people. And that's why we are continuously demanding for climate finance to help countries like mine be able to build their economies, but in the most sustainable way possible. So that is a close experience of that. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay. Oh, sorry, there was one I missed.
Yeah, so my question is with respect to what you said about the local governments and about the climate finance from the rest of the world that you suggested is needed. So my understanding is that from your words, I don't know the situation very well, but from your words, the local governments seems not to be really interested in solving these issues because they're not relying on the climate activists and not really acting. And so how can really finance coming outside of Uganda help if the local governments through which the money will flow are not doing anything? So, like, what are your views there? And the second question is, can activists really join some platforms or discussion and make the dialogue more constructive and bring their views? Because my impression is that activists are really seen as noisemakers, and they're often tried to be get rid of. But and this doesn't help. Like, people get died, but it doesn't help to the cause. So can you really join and try to bring the constructive dialogue to, with the policymakers and other people? Thank you very much.
So there were two questions there. The first was around the past discussion we just had about local governments, particularly in Uganda, but also in many other countries, not engaging very well both with climate justice activists and climate action. And if international finance does come in, they would be expected to be managing some of these funds and these projects, I guess. So how do you see local governments being able to step up? Or we talk about capacity development a lot, but there's only so much you could do with capacity development, and those are my words, not the question. So how would local government change, or how would they be able to utilise foreign funding? And there was a second question about your last discussion on activisms perhaps being negatively portrayed as noisemakers. And you've obviously engaged with many platforms trying to provide constructive engagement. And what are your recommendations or key messages around activists engaging with different platforms and providing that constructive dialogue or constructive information or viewpoint?
Yeah, I think when I can start with the last question, I wouldn't say that, activists are making noise, because, I mean, they're just we are trying to show the world that we are in a crisis, and the world just doesn't seem to get that and understand that. And personally, I wouldn't call it noise when someone is saying 20 million people are starving because of a drought that is being driven by the climate crisis. I wouldn't call it noise if cyclones are leaving thousands of people displaced. So this is a crisis, and it has to be treated as a crisis. But unfortunately, not all of us are treating it as a crisis. It's not even about the necessary resources that are needed to address climate change. The resources are available, but what we need is the will of the leaders, and also the will of the public in general, to be able to come together and work together and demand for climate justice. So I wouldn't call it noise if what we are talking about is something that is happening, not something that we think is going to happen. People are actually losing their lives and their livelihoods and farms and sources of income as the climate crisis escalates. So we just need to support, the people that are working for a better planet. It can be through, platforms like this. It can be through media interviews. In whatever way that can be done, I think all the support is needed for activists, especially those that are working on the grassroots. There is a need to platform, there is a need to amplify, there is a need to support financially, there is a need to just, be a part of this climate movement, because in the end, it's for a better future and a better planet for all of us. You know, if a person survives, you know, the climate crisis, someone, either their relative or their child or their grandchild, will be impacted. So this is something that will impact anyone, either directly or indirectly. So it can be that it could impact you as a person, but it also can be that your child or your grandchild or someone within your family says, I'm experiencing this because you didn't do anything about it. You know, the planet is, all this is happening, the crisis is escalating because we didn't do anything about it. So it's a place of understanding that this is a crisis and we must treat it as a crisis. And when it comes to, you know, local governments, I can say that when it comes to local governments, we do, you know, hear them talk about climate change. We hear them talk about planting trees and all that. We do hear them, but I think there is that lack of conversation, like I said, or that lack of interest in the work that activists are doing. I don't know, I can't explain why, you know, they wouldn't want to have conversations with us. But I can say that, you know, many of these governments, they're expected to do something about the climate. So I believe that when the necessary finance is available, you know, maybe they have the capacity, you know, to be able to implement it in what is needed. But I think the problem is the conversation. There is like a push out of that dialogue with activists, because sometimes I think they feel either activists are too young or they're making noise, but that is not the case. We've seen a problem and we know what needs to be done. So there is a need to have like that intergenerational conversation. There is a need to work together, that even when the much needed climate finance has been available, then it is not wasted, you know, or it is not lost through corruption and all that, but it's actually implemented. And I also think there is a need for I'm not a finance expert when it comes to climate issues, but whether there is one or there is none, but I think there is a need for a specific architecture to help, you know, guide countries, to help guide local governments on how to implement the necessary climate finance, how to invest it in the different, you know, climate solutions. And also I think there is a need for accountability. If that kind of system is in place, if that kind of architecture is in place, where countries can count when it comes to the money that has been provided, and to see if it was really used to build, you know, mitigation and adaptation implementations within the countries. So I believe that, you know, there is a need for dialogue with local government. I also believe that local government can have the capacity for implementation, but there is a need for an architecture to foresee all that and a place of accountability to see whether this has been used by the local government or not.
I think those are all really interesting points. You've mentioned climate finance quite a lot, and I'm sure it worries many of us that sometimes finance comes with an agenda or some assumptions about a country or locality that are very difficult to move away from if a community or a group or a activist group feel that it's not right. And we have seen failures in adaptation projects and processes all over the world. So your view is that, this is a question, not a statement. Your view is that activism can act as some accountability as well as grassroots information on how to spend wisely.
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, there is a place for, activists to see that, these implementations are actually happening on the ground. And that's why we need activists in every room.
I'll just see if there's perhaps one last question. Yes, perhaps we'll fit in two more. We'll see about the time.
Can you hear me? Thank you so much, Vanessa. Really so nice to see you. Finally, a climate activist in my 10 years of academic career. I have been attending so many conferences, and finally, there's someone live. I picked a few points from your talk. One, you say Africa contributed historically 4% of greenhouse gas emission, but have been suffering significantly due to the climate crisis. That's well justified. And also you talked about many times climate finance, and probably by this you mean the climate polluters should pay for the loss and damage, if I get it right. So my question, I have two questions. First is, so probably these are the top 10 or 20 climate polluters. These are 20 countries, I remember, and all of them are very, very developed countries. My first question is, you're seeking funding for your adaptation and mitigation from countries. Many of them have been involved in transatlantic slavery for many centuries. And also they were involved in colonization. And also for American or native population genocide. But they haven't, of course, compensated for anything at all, haven't said sorry yet. And from these same countries, you are seeking for climate finance to mitigate and adapt and rebuild your communities after. So my question is, do you see any hope these countries would contribute towards climate finance? Because already I was reading an article from BBC News today, just published. It said these countries, the developed countries, they don't want to finance because if they promise now, let's say 100 billion every year, they assume it might be for many centuries to come to contribute towards this finance, and they really don't agree. So my first question is, do you see any hope? And second question is about climate activism. We have thousands and thousands of articles, books, scientists are working, and also so many people are involved. I understand climate science is a very new topic. It's been 30 to 40 years. We heard about human-induced climate change, and we had 27 COP. My question is, do you see any hope how you can contribute as an activist for resolving this kind of problem? Because there are thousands of scientists out there, politicians and policymakers. What additional value you add into solving this problem? So that's it from me. Thank you.
Okay, Vanessa, so they were very, thank you very much, very useful but very long questions. So I'm going to try to paraphrase. But I will start by saying that the person who asked the question, Bias, first thanked you for being present and said that in 10 years of academic conferences, you're the first live activist he's seen. So we're very excited about that. I should have started by saying we all are very excited to have you here. So the first question was around, I suppose, a historical context in which Africa in particular was, I suppose, experiencing, I'm not quite sure what word to use, slavery and colonization, of course, from many of the countries who are now requested to provide climate finance. And so given that there's a history of those kinds of countries not apologising to the countries that experienced slavery, colonisation and exploitation, and also a lack of finance and recompensation for those issues, the key question was, do you have hope that countries like that who are now expected or requested or have already committed finance for this climate injustice will also now contribute and pay up, in essence? I might ask this first question now and leave that with you, and then ask the second one next.
Yes, first of all, I want to say that when it comes to the climate crisis, it's greatly and deeply rooted in the history of colonialism, and that's not something that, you know, we should sideline. That is something that happened, and we know that, you know, the global north greatly developed at the expense of the resources in the global south. So when we, you know, demand for climate finance, I think I had something about polluter pays principle. I believe in the polluter pays principle, and, you know, beyond that, it's a matter of global cooperation and solidarity, especially for the most affected people and the most affected areas, to provide the necessary climate finance for mitigation, adaptation, and additional finance for loss and damage that is already happening right now. So do I have hope? I will first of all say that last year there was a lot of mobilization around loss and damage towards COP26 and also during COP26. And of course, we were pushing and demanding for a loss and damage facility, something that was, you know, reduced to a Glasgow dialogue. But I can say that, you know, to me, that was a place of, you know, mobilizing and not giving up until we got, you know, the dialogue, which we know is not enough. But now we are moving from a place of a dialogue to, you know, a facility. Now we are pushing for a facility. So I believe there are reasons of hope to see how much, you know, conversation around loss and damage is reaching so many people, and how much it's, you know, being talked about now in the rooms. I was in Bonn for a few days, and, you know, most of the people I was meeting, the conversation was on loss and damage and the need for a loss and damage facility. And I think there's really been momentum and movement building around loss and damage, and we saw that at COP26, and we hope to see that same thing at COP27, and hopefully get a facility to be put in place. So one thing I can say is that the countries in the global north cannot, you know, deny anymore that loss and damage is happening. Whether they want to or not, they're in a place whereby they can't say, you know, they can't say that loss and damage is not happening. And we know that there are some countries in the global north that are blocking this facility to be put in place. But we cannot give up, because I mean, when you try to think about, you know, what you would have, you know, what we can get if we don't give up, I think there's really hope in that, to see the very vision, and like to carry the very vision and to keep looking at that vision of why we started, for example, mobilizing and demanding for a loss and damage facility. Why did we start it in the first place? In the end, it's to help the people. So have people been helped? Has a facility been put in place? Not yet. But it doesn't mean that, you know, we give up now. I think that that there's been a lot of momentum really built, and, you know, many people coming on board to talk about the need for a loss and damage facility. And I think that's something that we can hold on towards hope, even as we head towards COP27.
Thank you. I'm very glad glad to hear that you still have optimism. And we have one last question, which I think we'll probably close with, because thank you, Bias, I think it is a good question to close on. And that is that we hear about climate change in the UK and in other countries every day now, media, from scientists, from all sorts of sources. And in your experience since 2019, what do activists bring to the discussion? What do they achieve, perhaps, or what do they highlight that others don't?
I think that activists really bring the truth to the table, and I think that activists speak this truth to power, and activists tell the science as it is, and they talk about the climate crisis as it really is. And I've seen that activists treat the climate crisis as a crisis, and they really highlight how this is not something that is coming in the future, but it's something that is happening right now. So I think when it comes to activists, we've been able to tell the uncomfortable truth about the climate crisis, what people don't want to hear, but what people actually need to hear when it comes to the climate crisis. So I think that, that is something that activists have brought to the table, and it's very much needed in our fight for the climate crisis. We shouldn't sugarcoat this crisis. We should tell it as it is, because no one can sugarcoat starvation. No one can sugarcoat destruction. When it happens as it is, in the magnitude that it happens. So we need to speak it and say it as it is, and be very clear about the demands that we want, and the kind of future that we want, the kind of present that we want. So that's why everyone should really listen to what activists are saying, but above all, should listen to the science, because the activists are speaking the science. So listen to the science and what the science is telling us when it comes to addressing, the climate crisis. The IPCC report showed us that, climate change is already killing people around the world. So we should listen to the science from that is being given by the scientists. And I believe that's what activists have been doing for this whole time, to tell the science as it is.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I think we've run over time a little bit, so we really appreciate you being here. We really appreciate you dialing in live. And although you can't see the whole audience, we're all really appreciative of your message, your time, and your ongoing work, of course, from Uganda. So, thank you.